Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the channel. There has been speculation for years about Dana White in the UFC protecting star UFC fighters from USADA randomized PED testing, as well as protecting them from consequences from positive PED test results. Well, Dana White recently made some statements, and I'm going to play the clip for you later in this video, that raised some eyebrows about the legitimacy of USADA and whether or not they're actually independent from the UFC. So first off, before I get into any of that, we're going to talk about pre-USADA, post-USADA, the incident with Jon Jones. We're going to talk about Vitor Belfort, which was a big story pre-USADA. And then we're also going to talk about whether or not I think USADA actually works to clean up the sport of MMA in the UFC in particular, obviously because they're the only organization that has independent PED randomized testing. So first off, before USADA was even hired, they were hired back in 2015 to do randomized testing of fighters. The commissions were in charge of testing for PEDs. And what that meant was they tested you on fight night. That was pretty much it. They tested you on fight night. It was basically an intelligence test, because if you come into fight night dirty from using a PED, basically you're an idiot. You know when they're going to test you. And Dana White in the UFC always used to receive criticism because they're the biggest MMA organization. And people used to say, there's guys that are, a lot of fighters are speculating they're cheating. One in particular was Vitor Belfort, who had a crazy career resurgence and a massive physique change. And Dana White's response to all the criticism for a long time was, we're regulated by the government. That was his go-to line. We are regulated by the government. They test the athletes. Well, we all knew that was just a bogus excuse because he did not want to pay to have a company like USADA do randomized PED testing. And Vitor Belfort, for example, always fought in Brazil. And they were saying, well, they were protecting him in Brazil because just by nature, testing from the commission, because occasionally the commission would try to do a couple weeks out from the fight testing, but for the most part, they only did it on fight night. They were protecting him in Brazil because Brazil did not even have an athletic commission. And Vitor Belfort was jacked as could be. He was knocking guys dead like Luke Rockhold, Michael Bisping, who changed the career of Michael Bisping, and he only has one eye now because of the knockout from Vitor Belfort. And basically at this point in time, everyone knew Vitor Belfort was on PEDs. And they kept asking the UFC and Dana White about this. And they kept saying the same old line, we are regulated by the government. Well, eventually there was enough pressure that was built where USADA was hired in 2015. And what USADA does is they're supposed to be an independent company that comes in and they have the whereabouts of all the UFC fighters who are currently on the roster. They're supposed to fill out an online form letting the USADA company know where they're at all times. So essentially USADA can come and test them at any time, wherever they are, no matter what country they're in. Depending on where you're at, it may be hard to get someone to go perform a test. And a lot of times USADA may hire somebody from that country to go perform the test, and that leaves room for corruption. And people talk about it all the time. There's guys hiding in Thailand using PEDs. I don't know the legitimacy of all that. But the point is, USADA was hired to clean up the sport. They were going to do randomized drug testing of all the UFC fighters, and they were going to try to find out who was using PEDs. And USADA has caught some high-level athletes. They caught TJ Dillashaw using EPO years ago when he went down to flyweight to try to close down the division, and he lost to Henry Cejudo. They caught him of EPO. They caught Jon Jones with a pulsing picogram. And this was back when he was supposed to fight Gustafsson for the second time. Jon Jones had just been caught right before UFC 200. And then he was caught again before his fight against Gustafsson. And he got caught also when he fought Daniel Cormier, I believe, at UFC 214. Well, he was supposed to fight Gus, and USADA popped Jon Jones. And this was a massive fight. We were finally getting Jon Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson 2. People were dying to see this fight. This was a big headliner for the UFC. This was a New Year's Eve card, and USADA popped him. And then eventually what came out was that it was a picogram. And supposedly what this picogram was from was when he previously used PEDs, and this was a result of that previous use, and there had been no new use of PEDs. But the Nevada Athletic Commission was not able to say they could let Jon Jones fight. They said he tested positive. We can't let him fight regardless of what USADA is saying. So the UFC said, well, this is what USADA is saying. They used USADA as their cover for this fight, and they moved the fight on a couple days' notice from Las Vegas to California so they could have Jon Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson. And they basically said, USADA, this is the science from USADA. It was a picogram from former PED use, and everything is fine. And at this point in time, people really started to question the legitimacy of USADA. And at the end of the day, I believe that USADA will catch some cheaters. Obviously, it caught TJ Dillashaw. It caught Jon Jones. I believe they will catch some cheaters. But I believe if you have enough money to pay the right people, you can get away and not be caught by USADA. And also, you have some holes in the game. People talk about this all the time, where other countries, they may not get tested as much because it may be a harder place to access by people who are able to perform the testing from USADA. And you look at Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor broke his leg back at UFC 264, July of 2021. And you can look up how many times an athlete has been tested. Conor McGregor has not been tested one time in 2022. So there's another instance where you have a star fighter in Conor McGregor where, he's not being tested. He looks jacked as ever. And I'm not saying Conor McGregor is using PEDs, but I'm just saying I understand the people who are skeptical of USADA. People talk about Israel Adesanya all the time, another star who's had issues. People talk about Kamaru Usman and the unbelievable cardio, and they say he's on EPO too. And I understand that people would doubt the legitimacy of USADA, even though the UFC claims, they're 100% independent. We have no say over them. We just hire them. They're an independent agency. And that sounds great if they truly were independent. And I've had my questions over the years, and I truly believe, again, any fighter that has the right amount of money can find a way to cheat. But Dana White, recently there was an incident with Paulo Costa, and Paulo Costa was randomly drug tested the day of the weigh-ins before UFC 278. And what happened is they woke him up. He was cutting weight, the night before. They woke him up at 6 a.m. on the day of weigh-ins, and they wanted to get a sample to test him for PEDs. And that's fine and dandy, but it's terrible when a fighter's trying to cut weight and they got to fight, the next day. And you have a fighter like Paulo Costa who cuts a lot of weight. And what happened is Paulo Costa came out and complained. We've seen this from Alexander Volkanovski. He said he was woken up the day before the Max Holloway rematch. He complained about it as well. Well, you had Paulo Costa complain and say, this was not good for his weight cut at all. And basically, he gave the middle finger to USADA. And Dana White was asked about this at the UFC 278 post-fight. And Dana White had some very interesting things to say. And I'm going to play that clip for you now. So go ahead and check that out.
I don't know if you heard yesterday, but Paulo Costa said USADA came and blood tested him.
I apologized to him up on stage. That'll never happen again to any fighter.
Is that something that you guys can control, or is that a USADA thing? How does that happen? Because it seems quite dangerous for a guy.
Yeah, it's just, you listen, again, how to explain, they don't know about fighting the way that people who know about fighting know about fighting. You don't go in and test a guy at 6 a.m. when he's cutting weight, and it's just, the result's going to be the same a few hours later. You wait. And I apologized to him on stage when he came out, and that won't happen to another fighter again.
So there you hear it straight from Dana White at the UFC 278 post-fight presser. He's asked about Paulo Costa being woke up in the early morning hours of the day of UFC 278 weigh-ins to be tested by USADA. And Dana White says, I apologize to Paulo Costa, and it will never happen again. And it will never happen to another fighter again. And while I'm not arguing, for fighters to be tested the morning of weigh-ins, I think it's particularly jarring in a public setting on video. Dana White is essentially saying we can manipulate when USADA can perform their randomized PED testing. And I just think that's just crazy, especially when you look back over the years. Dana White in the UFC, since signing up for USADA back in 2015, has touted, we have the best drug testing of any sport. This is an independent organization in USADA doing the PED testing. And now he's saying basically we get to control USADA and what hours they can and cannot test fighters. And I just think that sounds ridiculous, because if they're willing to say that in public, what is Dana White willing to say behind closed doors or dictate to USADA about potential star UFC fighters? You think if USADA popped Conor McGregor for a PED, you don't think Dana White's trying to lean on them or potentially going to get rid of the whole organization? Next thing you know, you're going to hear UFC and USADA part ways, and we're not going to hear any story. And it's going to be because someone like Conor McGregor could test positive. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm just saying this is supposed to be an independent drug testing organization, and it's supposed to be randomized. If it's not randomized, how could it possibly work? And now Dana White's saying essentially, there's no way you're going to be tested the morning of weigh-ins. And again, I'm not saying that's what should happen, but there's no way that Dana White should be able to say, okay, USADA's not going to be testing these hours anymore, because guys will constantly look for ways to cheat the system. And again, I'm not saying that it needs to happen constantly. I'm not saying it needs to happen at all. But the fact that Dana White can come out and say, USADA, you're only allowed to test these certain hours, it's not that statement as a whole is particularly damning. It's just when you think about if he's willing to do that, what else is going on behind the scenes between Dana White and USADA? And it really leads me to believe that there could be sketchy things going on behind the scenes with Dana White, with the UFC, with USADA, with Jon Jones and his picogram. That's a big fight. You think, let's say Conor McGregor is fighting, Charles Oliveira for the lightweight title. I'm just making up a scenario. And 1 week out from the fight, it's headlining International Fight Week 2023. 1 week out from the fight, Conor McGregor tests positive. And USADA informs Conor, informs the UFC, because they don't inform the public anymore until the investigation has been completed. You think Dana White ain't going to try to slime ball his way out of that scenario? 100% he is. And if he's able to do this with the timing of the test, I believe he's able to do anything. And this is supposed to be an independent drug organization that's testing randomly. So I just thought this was something that Dana White said at the UFC 278 post-fight presser. And PEDs have been a big topic lately with Israel Adesanya, all the speculation around his gyno, and Kamaru Usman fighting at UFC 278, and people speculating about EPO because of his unbelievable cardio. And I just thought this was something that deserved to be pointed out. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.